I started in college, as all of you are, as a history major. I'm sure most of you have made the usual connection between history. My specific interest was American history. I did my senior work on the Lyceum movement in the 1800s in the States. I'm sure all of you have studied it extensively in your preparation for the financial markets. Okay, not at all. I did spend a couple of terms abroad. I went to school in France for 2 semesters, or more accurately trimesters. I went to a school called Carleton College that was on a 3-term calendar. And I ran a business out of my dorm room. The mention here about from dorm room cassette tapes to trading pits was in the, Henry made the reference earlier to Happy Prime Day. Before there was Amazon and before there was Pandora and Spotify and whatever else it is that you use to consume and share music on, people just as much then as now still shared music, but they'd share music by running records, vinyl, a little bit resurgent among the hip, back and forth between dorm rooms and recording it on cassette tapes. If the slides ever show up, there's a picture of a cassette tape, which seems like a bizarre thing to put on a financial talk slide, but the essence of it was that I found a business, a niche, if you will, supplying cassette tapes to my fellow college students. I did it because it seemed like there was a need and it was a way to make some money. It financed pretty much all of my fun for the last 2 years of college. Never in my wildest did I think that it would lead to trading pits and that I'd build a career on it. If I look at the people that I interviewed when I was a senior in college, it ranged from the usual suspects at the time, banks and various firms that came to campus to recruit. I had a job offer from Procter & Gamble, and if it were not for those cassette tapes, I would probably be pushing Pampers to this day. The fact of the matter is, I kid you not. But I ended up accepting a position with the Pillsbury Company, and people think about Pillsbury as the doughboy and whatnot, but at the time, this is probably 5 buyouts ago, they had something called the Feed Ingredient Merchandising Unit, which was a fancy way of saying cash market agricultural trading. So American history, we covered that, dorm room college business, agricultural commodities trading, Fawcett Corp. Had anyone ever heard of Steve Fawcett? He's the guy who flew around the world nonstop solo in a balloon. Then he flew around the world nonstop solo in an aircraft. Steve hired me. I traded agricultural commodities long enough to find out that it was interesting, and I like this whole thing. You heard the word basis earlier. Somehow that clicked for me, and the idea of trading things based on pricing relationships, it just clicked. It made sense. I couldn't tell you why, but it made sense. Steve hired me. I worked for him on the floor of the CBOE for 3 years. I went on to fund myself, to back myself. I was an independent options market maker on the floor of the CBOE. Henry made reference to trading on floors. Henry, you traded on several, and then you went to Europe too, didn't you? So you look at that experience, and it was formative. It was really pivotal. I was on the floor for a decade and a half, became very, very heavily involved in the CBOE, and was ultimately the vice chairman of the exchange. From there, I joined a firm called Interactive Brokers. At the time, it was better known as Timber Hill, run by a gentleman named Thomas Petterfee. From Interactive, I was involved in the formation of one of the exchanges, Box. From there, John made reference to NQLX. It was actually a joint venture between NASDAQ, our hosts here today, and Life, the big futures market in London. And after that, I had the privilege of joining ISE. I see Molly McGregor in the back. We've got a few ISE alums. ISE is actually a NASDAQ company today. A year ago in 10 days, it became a NASDAQ company. In fact, coming out of that deal, that's why I have the luxury of saying, what did you call me? Independent financial executive. So at ISE, I was involved in companies in a lot of different ways. I ran something called corporate initiatives. I was the chief strategy officer, which is a polite way of saying the deal guy. One of the deals that worked out spectacularly well, and it was a privilege, was working with Jerry. So I came on Jerry's board and led early investment in Jerry's company. Two companies you probably haven't heard of, Ballista and Quadraserve. To be completely candid, they didn't work out as well. But when you look at finance, when you look at your career, a risk-free life tends to be a little bit of a boring life. A very, very high-risk life can carry some bumps and bruises, and you have to be able to accept the risk that you take. And everyone has a different tolerance for that risk. There were some things like Hanwick that worked out well. The ISE Stock Exchange, which as a deal rolled into Direct Edge, which in turn rolled into something called BATS, which in turn is now part of the CBOE. That deal worked out very, very well. There was another that was both a failure and a success. I say from DOA to HKJC, it was a company called Longitude that we bought first jointly with Goldman Sachs, and then we bought out Goldman. It was a company that had failed. They had $40 million in startup capital, had churned through almost all of it, and a case of what I sometimes refer to as dumpster diving. We bought it for pennies on the dollar, but turned it into a real company. So, unexpected connections. We'll play a little bit of a game, that same thing, and this is where I'm your lab rat, guinea pig. Let's look at this. Okay, that was a quick chronology. I collapsed 30-something years into about 3 minutes. Agricultural commodities trader. I was a feed ingredient merchandiser for Pillsbury. How did I get that job? That was my first job out of school. Was it because I did my work in history on the American Lyceum movement? Probably not. It was the dorm room college business. The people that were recruiting for Pillsbury and they were recruiting traders actually asked me to start immediately. Could I please leave that pesky thing called college? I didn't think that was a good idea. Finish school. Glad I did. They still hired me. They were looking at that entrepreneurial thing, you know, buying and selling thousands and thousands of cassette tapes on a little campus in rural Minnesota. A little bit strange, but before you could stream things, before Amazon would deliver anything overnight, it was an entrepreneurial opportunity. What did I do next? Fawcett Corporation. Steve built a marvelous business backing young traders in the pits. He bought many, many seats around the country and leased them out. He built a clearing firm. Steve had a ferocious appetite for risk, and it was reflected personally. And he was a marvelous man. It's about 10 years ago he died in a plane crash. He took risk at a different level. What's not clear, why did Steve hire me? Because I was another one of the countless young traders that applied to his company. I'd had this agricultural experience, then I decided I wanted to trade on a big market. Chicago or New York. I had the chance, the privilege to move to Chicago. He focused on the two terms in France. Was he a francophone? Was there something interesting to him? No, it was because while I was in France, I bicycle raced. And Steve had a singular fixation on endurance sports. That's what was interesting to him. CBOE options market maker. Well, that actually is not a huge surprise. I had the experience with Steve. Steve backed me. And then having the chance to actually back myself, it was a natural progression. So it's not an unexpected connection. Interactive brokers. What was it that Thomas Petterfee saw in me? Why did he decide to take a risk on me and bring me onto board? Well, I had the CBOE experience, and that was something that was useful to him. Not as a trader. Thomas built staggeringly sophisticated computer models. In fact, I would argue he was on the cutting edge, and the fact that he was made it very interesting to go work for that firm, because at the time, you could actually see the freight train of electronics coming. I was a pit trader, screaming and yelling, and it was very clear that I was going to have to change and reinvent myself, and a lot of this is about reinvention, or I was going to have to join someone that was very much part of the vanguard, moving towards the electronic world. And what Thomas Petterfee was building was clearly that. But he was interested in what I had done for the CBOE, but RJR Nabisco, Barbarians at the Gate. Does anyone have any recollection of that deal? At the time, it was the largest largest leveraged buyout in the history of corporate America. Interactive Brokers, and more accurately Timber Hill and Thomas Petterfee and I have a dubious distinction that we share. The two of us were the ones that sold all the calls that the inside traders came to buy on RJR Nabisco in the 2 days before the deal became public. There was ferocious insider trading. I had a very, very bad day at work that day when it hit. It was really kind of staggering. But that failure actually led to, it was a building block for opportunity. NQLX, John mentioned, NQLX was a terrific experience, and I learned an enormous amount. I'd lived on the security side of the world for the first part of my career, and this was my introduction to CFTC regulation, to a new product, to a new marketplace, building something from scratch and working with some terrific people. The Interactive Brokers experience was actually how I got that position, but it was a failed deal that really triggered it. Not Box. I had a privilege of working on that, and that's gone on, and it has a place in the markets. But a deal that never saw the light of day, and the principals who worked on that deal were what led to my being asked to lead NQLX. ISE Corporate Initiatives, what led to that? David Krell and Gary Katz and we got to know each other both from the NQLX work and my work at the CBOE. Longitude as a company, when we bought it, it was a failed company. I say DOA to HKJC. Does anyone know what the HKJC is? Jerry knows because we worked on it together. It's the Hong Kong Jockey Club. Longitude is a pari-mutuel platform that was developed for the financial markets. It's a marvelous platform, and at ISE, we rebuilt it from the ground up. Today, it's used by the Hong Kong Jockey Club for the calculation of the odds on their races for about a third of their turnover, something approaching $14 billion a year. Again, from a failure to a success. Longitude for Finance was that building block. So what are the takeaways? Just very quickly. Opportunity comes in a lot of different flavors. You can make your own opportunity. Some of you, I'm certain, have a vision. There's probably no accident that you're sitting in a room on Prime Day and that you're listening to people, all these veterans of the financial industry, and you're trying to figure out how you build your own careers. But you can't tell what the building blocks are going to be. If you had asked me 30 years ago, 35 years ago, that selling tape out of my dorm room was anything more than a way to fund my idea of a good time in college, and that it would actually lead to my being a trader on the floor of a major financial market, I would have looked at you cross-eyed. I had no idea. Failure can pay dividends. There is no telling if I would ever have had the opportunities I have had if I didn't take it on the chin more than once. It's just a fact. A risk-free life is a boring life. I'm not advocating taking stupid risk. Don't. Understand the risks. But you can't explore things if you don't take some risk. Personal connections, and that's been made reference to, Dick Rosenblatt said it in the earlier session, they are of immeasurable importance. And those relationships that you develop, you never know where they're going to come full circle. You don't know who you're going to end up working with, for, who. And common interest experiences, they connect. Steve Fawcett clicking on my bicycle racing, who would have known? So pursue your passions, pursue what interests you, and do it well. Do it with intensity. Learn to extrapolate and learn to reinvent, because things are changing, and they're changing at a terrific pace. We all have to change. I know I do. We all benefit from it. So thank you, and I wish you every success.